The first one looked at apartheid within the 1948 areas, if you like, Palestinian citizens of Israel and how they encounter apartheid. Tonight, the focus is on apartheid in the occupied territory, and we have an absolutely fantastic line of speakers for you. Since its foundation, Israel has built and maintained a system of institutionalized racist discrimination against all parts of the Palestinian people, whether they live under occupation in Israel or as refugees and as exiles. I myself, originally I'm from Jerusalem, although I wasn't born in Jerusalem. I'm unable to go back and live there, whereas a Jewish person from Birmingham can move to Israel and immediately be welcomed, given citizenship and so on. But furthermore, I was denied entry to Israel or through Israel to Palestine in 2017, simply because I speak out against what it does. And that's what it does to people. So we're looking to explore how the system actually operates and affects the everyday life of parts of the Palestinian people. When we talk about the occupied territory, the reference is to Palestinian land Israel occupied in 1967, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. And when Israel says it doesn't occupy Gaza, you know, make sure you know this, that all births and deaths are registered by Israel. So if it isn't an occupation, why is it registering deaths and births in Gaza? A really important note, we want this to be a really good informative experience. So please remember that all contributions in the chat must adhere to PSC's core aims and values, including opposition to all discrimination. Anyone violating this will be removed from the session. We have 3 speakers, two of them are already online here, and the other one will be joining us shortly. The second speaker will be Munir Nuseibah, Dr. Munir Nuseibah from Jerusalem. I'll give a fuller introduction at the time, but we're going to start with Dr. Yara Hawari. Yara is a senior Palestine policy fellow of al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. In addition to her work, academic work, which focused on indigenous studies and oral history, she's also a frequent political commentator, writing for various media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. So Yara is going to introduce the topic, to look at the definition of apartheid and look at it in the context of the West Bank and Gaza. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll take questions right at the end, but do put questions into the chat as we go along. So Yara, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and please start your presentation.
Thank you, Kamel, for the introduction, and thank you to all the comrades and friends joining us today. I'm going to start with a, is the sound okay? Can everyone hear me? I'd just like to do a check-in. I'm going to start with just a definition of what we're talking about of apartheid, because I think that's, sometimes it's taken for granted, we know exactly what it means. Apartheid is a system in which segregation is used to enforce the dominance of one group of people over another. Now, customary international law and the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court define apartheid as the following, and I quote, "Inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intent of maintaining that regime." So many of us, I'm sure, associate apartheid with South Africa, but the definition is universally applicable, and that really challenges the misconception that apartheid was an exceptional case and it ended with the South African case. This international law definition also allows us an understanding of apartheid as a system that can adopt various characteristics and manifest itself in multiple ways, including through a variety of economic policies. Now, an apartheid system can loosely be divided into 2 parts, grand apartheid and petty apartheid. Grand apartheid refers to the underlying system of segregation and racial discrimination that is really less visible to the naked eye, but it's essentially the thing that holds it all together. And Israel has really perfected grand apartheid across the Green Line so well that even advocates of Palestinian rights might not be able to see apartheid within Israel itself. Petty apartheid refers to the most visible parts of apartheid. So in South Africa, for example, this would be the known blacks allowed signs, the separation of water fountains, of entry and entry points for whites and blacks. Now, to some extent, petty apartheid also exists in Palestine. We see this with the separation of roads between Jews and Palestinians, but I'll go into that a bit later. Now, a significant moment in the discourse on Palestine, on apartheid in Palestine, was in 2017, when the UN Economic Social Commission for Western Asia, ESCWA, published a report, and I believe you were all sent that report ahead of this meeting. And the report was compiled by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley. It was entitled "Israeli Practices Towards the Palestinian People on the Question of Apartheid." And importantly, it stated from the very beginning that Israel has established an apartheid regime that dominates the people as a whole. And this conclusion was an important and defining one because it addressed not only Palestinians within the 1967 occupied territories, i.e. the West Bank and Gaza, but also those within the state of Israel and those in exile. And the report goes on to explain in detail how Israel enforces and maintains its apartheid regime against each categorization and community of Palestinians. Now, unsurprisingly, the report was pulled shortly after it was published, after immense pressure from the United States and Israel, and it actually led the Secretary General of ESCWA, Rima Khalaf, to resign. Now, the ESCWA report was groundbreaking because it was published by a UN body, but it's important to note that many Palestinian organizations and intellectuals have been arguing for the use of the apartheid analysis, especially since the dismantlement of the South African apartheid regime in the early 1990s. And more recently, they've been pushing back against the notion that Israel is on its way to becoming an apartheid state because of its de jure annexation plans. Rather, many Palestinians argue that Israel was established as an apartheid state from its very beginning. Since the ESCWA report, a lot of analysts, academics, human rights organizations have been using the apartheid definition to describe Israel's regime of control over the Palestinian people. Not only does it accurately describe the regime of segregation, but also because it's useful because it has a clear definition as a crime within international law, unlike settler colonialism, for example. Now, I want to stress here that the use of apartheid does not negate the settler colonial framework. Indeed, I think, and many others think and recognize Israel as a settler colonial regime. But what we find is that the apartheid analysis actually complements the settler colonial framework. It identifies the exact mechanism of control which is employed by the settler colonial project, in this case, the State of Israel. So I'm going to quickly talk about a few of the manifestations of apartheid in the West Bank to give you a better picture. The West Bank, of course, as many of you know, has been under Israeli military occupation since 1967, when it not only occupied the West Bank, but it also occupied Gaza and the Syrian Golan. It was immediately placed under martial law and almost immediately began with the settlement enterprise. And I'm sure many of you know this, the settlement enterprise was actually initiated and pioneered by an Israeli Labour government. And it, of course, we know that it was unequivocally declared as illegal by the international community. Because of the settlement enterprise, which sought to settle the lands with Israeli Jewish settlers, Israel had to enforce a separate system in which to govern the Palestinians, to maintain the distinction between the two populations, because it certainly didn't want to incorporate these Palestinians into the Israeli state, because this would eliminate the Jewish majority. So Palestinians were placed under military law, and Israeli Jewish settlers were placed under Israeli civilian law. And this two-tiered legal system is the first sign of apartheid in the West Bank. Since '67, Israel has also deliberately pursued fragmentation of the West Bank into these pockets of, or Palestinian Bantustans, and they're divided by intervening Jewish-only areas. And paradoxically, the Oslo Peace Accords facilitated the strategy by establishing borders for the Palestinian autonomy enclaves. Now, in addition to this military regime and the strategic fragmentation of the land, Israel carries out various practices that are prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention, including, and I'm just going to go through a few because of time constraints. Firstly, the forcible transfer of Palestinians to make way for illegal Israeli settlements. Palestinians are routinely uprooted from their homes. They have their land stolen under various pretenses, including security reasons. And this land is often developed for Israeli Jewish illegal settlements. Resources are diverted to the Israeli Jewish population. And it was certainly not by coincidence at all that during the Oslo Accords, when the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C, the area C was designated to be controlled by the Israeli army. Area C is over 60% of the West Bank, and what a coincidence, it has most of the natural resources and fertile land in the West Bank. Palestinians are also frequently denied building permits outside Area A, leaving Palestinian cities and towns outside of the Ramallah enclave increasingly under-resourced and suffocated. And the Israeli blockade in Gaza has resulted in even worse living conditions for the entrapped Palestinian population there. The second point, which is prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention, is denying Palestinians the right to freedom of movement. So the West Bank is littered with literally hundreds of checkpoints and military roadblocks which restrict Palestinian movement. And these roadblocks are located as such that it's impossible for one Palestinian locality, from one Palestinian locality to another without passing these checkpoints. And these checkpoints can be arbitrarily closed, and they're often sites of violence. Actually, a lot of Palestinians have been shot and they've been executed at these checkpoints. Of course, these checkpoints don't exist for Israeli Jews whose illegal settlements look very much like gated communities and have these access roads which take them directly across the Green Line. And many of these roads, as I mentioned earlier, it's forbidden for Palestinian cars to drive on them. And I want to stress here, because maybe for people who don't experience checkpoints, it's difficult to understand what a devastating effect this has. But it really does. It affects your ability to move freely. So in other words, every single journey in the West Bank, you have to take into consideration a checkpoint being closed, so you might not be able to make it to your destination. Palestinian traffic is all funneled onto one main road between the cities. And all of this means is that it takes so long to even travel a short distance. And imagine this day in and day out, and how much of a negative effect this has on Palestinian lives. The third point, or practice that's prohibited by the UN Apartheid Convention, includes murder, torture, unlawful imprisonment, and other severe deprivations of physical liberty. As I mentioned, Palestinians are frequently executed by Israeli soldiers. This can happen randomly. It can happen at protests or during military raids. The multiple bombardments of Gaza over the past decade is also an example of mass murder. Palestinians are routinely tortured during incarceration, which actually leads me to the final practice of apartheid that I want to highlight, and this is the persecution of Palestinians because of their opposition to apartheid. Now, since 1967, 800,000 Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza have been incarcerated by the Israeli regime, and this makes up 20% of the population. So it would be fair to say, really, that nearly every household in the West Bank and Gaza has been affected by incarceration. Many of these people are tried and charged through the Israeli military courts, which maintain a 99% conviction rate. And Israel is able to punish Palestinians for basically any political activity through its military orders, which they justify on the grounds of security. And under these orders, it's forbidden to conduct protests, it's forbidden to arrange political meetings of over 10 people. It's illegal to distribute political articles or pictures. They also often accuse and charge Palestinians of affiliation with political groups they deem terrorist organizations. So affiliation is a very broad term and charge that they use. Sharing a social media post, or even pouring a cup of coffee for a member of a declared illegal organization can be considered as affiliation. Now, all of these practices of apartheid have not gone unnoticed. And actually, Israel's treatment of Palestinians has been regularly cited by UN special rapporteurs on the human rights situation in Palestine as evidence of an apartheid system in action. Richard Falk, Professor of Law at Princeton University and was the UN Special Rapporteur between 2008 and 2014, wrote a report to the UN Human Rights Council, and in it he said that Israel is guilty of racial discrimination, apartheid, and torture. John Dugard as well, who's a South African law professor, and actually Falk's predecessor, wrote a detailed study in 2013 and charged Israel with apartheid. The UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination censored Israel in 2002 for implementing two entirely separate legal systems and sets of institutions for Jewish communities grouped in illegal settlements on the one hand, and Palestinian populations living in Palestinian towns and villages on the other. And there are plenty of other bodies that have confirmed Israeli apartheid, including the Russell Tribunal. Plenty of scholars, academics, South African activists have talked about Israeli apartheid. Just an ending point. I want to highlight that Israeli apartheid doesn't only exist in the West Bank and Gaza. I was asked to talk about the West Bank and Gaza, which I hope I did so concisely in the short amount of time that I had. That Israel apartheid really does exist from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and they hide it very well. And so for those who perhaps don't have a more nuanced understanding or who haven't been to Palestine, may struggle to see it. But this is an apartheid regime. And I hope I have given a concise snapshot, and of course we can delve into more points during the discussion time.
Thank you very much indeed, Yara. And yes, you have given a really concise description of a very, very broad subject and the comparison with South Africa and so on. So thank you very much indeed for that. That was really, really helpful. Our second speaker is Dr. Munir Nuseibah, who is an assistant professor of international law and the head of the Al-Quds Human Rights Clinic, Al-Quds University in Jerusalem, Palestine. The last time we hosted Munir, he spoke to us about or was part of a webinar on the impact of Corona on Jerusalem quite a few months ago. But it's lovely to have you with us again. Very well placed with the Dome of the Rock picture behind you to talk to us about Jerusalem and the impact of apartheid there. Thank you very much. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hawwash, and thank you for inviting me to speak Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I always appreciate your work. And thanks to Yara also for her great talk and introduction with very important details about the West Bank. And I would like to say here that with what Dr. Yara Hawari ended with, that this is a system, it's a regime that works in different places and is functioning. The apartheid in this regime is functioning as a total regime. And I think you're doing a great methodology here of zooming in the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, zooming in the 48 territory or Israel, and then looking at the refugees and the displaced persons. This is good, but it's always important to remember that in order to understand the regime, we always have to zoom out again. So that's very important. But I'm going to zoom in again to Jerusalem now, as I've been asked to. To start, I should say that in 1948, during the war in which Israel was established on 78% of the land of Palestine, Israel conquered among these 78% of Palestine, the western part of Jerusalem, which became widely known as West Jerusalem. And in this, during this period, Israel totally cleansed West Jerusalem from all Palestinians. So the West Jerusalem neighborhoods were full of Palestinians before, but immediately after the war, there were no more Palestinians living there until today. Then in 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the eastern part of Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip. And as soon as they did that, they annexed the eastern part of Jerusalem, and which also justifies why I'm giving a different talk than the one that Dr. Hawari gave before me. It annexed East Jerusalem, which means effectively that since then it has been applying Israeli law, domestic Israeli law in East Jerusalem. So not the same body of laws that Israel is implementing in the West Bank and that it implemented in the past in Gaza Strip. These laws did not and still do not apply in East Jerusalem, the military regime that is built there. Alternatively, they have been applying the same legal body that they would apply anywhere else in Israel. However, this doesn't mean that the Palestinians in East Jerusalem or the eastern part of Jerusalem have been enjoying equality in any way. On the contrary, they have been treated always in a special way, using the same legal regime that Israel uses for its own citizens anywhere else. And I'm going to focus on a number of issues that are part of Israel's regime of colonization that affect the Palestinians in Jerusalem. And that we can call as inhumane acts to maintain this regime of domination. And I will start with the very civil status that was given to the Palestinians in Jerusalem back in 1967. Since I did mention that Israel annexed East Jerusalem, but at the time and until today, they haven't really annexed the population. They gave the Palestinian population a residency status when they annexed Jerusalem. They used a law called Entry into Israel Law, which basically treats visas. It deals with visas, entry visas to Israel. Any people who are not citizens, how do we treat them? How do they enter Israel? What are their rights in Israel? This is the type of law that they used with us. So they gave a permanent residency status, which has many issues and problems linked to it that have been developing from bad to worse as time has been going. Permanent residency status means that you can live in the city and in Israel, that you can work there, you pay taxes, and you become a member of the social welfare system and the medical insurance system. But you do not vote in the political elections, parliament or anything else. But more importantly, this status has two main problems. The first problem is that it can be revoked easily. Since 1967, Israel has been developing and making worse, actually, the methods according to which it could revoke residencies from Palestinians in Jerusalem. In the 70s, your residency would be revoked if you're a Jerusalemite, if you left the country for a period of 7 years or got a residency, a permanent residency abroad or a citizenship abroad. Then when the so-called peace process started in the early 90s, Israel quickly changed that system, and they invented and started applying a new criterion for revocation of residency called center of life. According to this new criterion, if your center of life is outside Israel, then you will have your residency revoked even without necessarily being told that it's going to be revoked. In fact, what the Israeli Supreme Court said is that your residency revocation expires, even though it's permanent, but if you live somewhere else, it expires. So it doesn't even need an action to be revoked. It simply expires. So it's your fault. And even the Supreme Court used this, a famous judge called Harun Barak, he used this statement. He said, you uprooted yourself from Israel and rooted yourself elsewhere if you moved your center of life somewhere else. So this type of, so this has led to the revocation of thousands and thousands of residencies from Palestinians in Jerusalem. If you live anywhere in the West Bank or Gaza, or if you live abroad, or if you spend a lot of time in these areas, then your center of life is set to have expired, or your residency has expired because you've moved your center of life outside Israel. This has actually affected a lot of people because in the past, people used to own houses maybe somewhere else in the West Bank, to live in other places. But now you have to stay on a certain, in certain areas and neighborhoods, which are very crowded most of the time. In order to be able to protect your legal status. And then more recently, Israel introduced a new criterion for residency revocation known as breach of allegiance. They invented this in 2006 when the Palestinian elections happened, and when some members of the Palestinian Legislative Council were elected in Jerusalem, they revoked their residency status. And they said that these people have breached their allegiance to the state of Israel, although we're not citizens, so we don't have allegiance in the first place. But anyway, they breached the allegiance and they revoked their residency. And these guys went to the Supreme Court to trying to change that, but the Supreme Court actually kept and sustained that revocation. And asked the government to make it legal by going to the Supreme Court, to the Parliament, to get a law, to actually enact a law. So Israel enacted a law for revoking residencies in that way. Another thing that is also related to residency is child registration. So since Palestinians are not citizens, they cannot, if they have children, their children do not get registered as Jerusalemites as well. They don't get that residency status automatically. You need to fulfill certain criteria in order to be able to register your children as residents. And this has led to thousands of Palestinians failing these criteria. And I work in a center that provides legal aid to Palestinians. And these two issues are two of the most important issues we work on. We work with many families who have failed to register their children as residents. And this means that there are children who live in Jerusalem on a daily basis, but they don't exist actually on the Israeli population registry. They do not get any type of rights that are linked to that residency status. They cannot get free education, they cannot get medical care, and all these other services. And what's important to say here is that these types of violations and this treatment happens only to Palestinians. If you're Jewish and you're born anywhere in, and this is according to the Israeli law, anywhere in Israel, even if you're a tourist Jewish couple coming here and you visiting, and and a baby was born during this visit, this baby automatically becomes an Israeli citizen only because that baby has a Jewish family. So, you know, these policies apply only to Palestinians, and they are only for demographic control. There is also the issue of family unification restrictions. Israel prevents Palestinians from Jerusalem or elsewhere in Israel, those also have citizenship, to invite family members from the West Bank and Gaza to get a permanent residency status or a citizenship in Israel. And if you marry someone from Gaza, actually, you cannot even get any type of permit to live or to reside in Jerusalem. So many families live apart from each other, or the Palestinian from Jerusalem will have to actually travel and live somewhere else in order to live with his spouse or her spouse, who is from especially Gaza, but also likely from the West Bank. But if they do that, then they will lose their own status in Jerusalem because of Center of Life movement. So this is keeping the Palestinians on a daily basis running to prove going to the Ministry of Interior just to be able to live in the city, just to do to go through the daily life that people should take for granted in other parts of the world.
One more minute.
One more minute. I would only say in this minute that there are many other areas of domination in that way. One of them would be building restrictions. Israel severely restricts Palestinians building anything in Jerusalem. But on the contrary, you will find that it is building Israeli settlements very heavily in Jerusalem. There are 15 illegal Israeli settlements only for Jews in Jerusalem with 210,000 settlers. And also the same things that Yara mentioned before regarding freedom of expression, regarding assembly, and regarding political life. The same types of restrictions that exist in the West Bank, they also exist in Jerusalem. So if you try to resist the apartheid regime, if you try to speak against it, you are always put in a situation where you will be severely punished. So I will stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Munir. That was really, really helpful. I'm going to move very quickly on to our third speaker because Diana Buttu, who's joining us, can only be with us for a short while, but we're really delighted to welcome her. Diana is a Palestinian-Canadian lawyer and policy advisor to al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She was also recently a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And the last time we saw her in person was when she spoke to our AGM a couple of years ago. So really delighted to have you with us, Diana, and I'll hand over to you to speak, I think for about 10 minutes, and I hope you're able to take at least one question when we finish. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm actually only going to be able to speak for a little bit under 5 minutes because I actually have another event that I have to jump over to very shortly. But that being said, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to everybody for joining in these very difficult times. I'm delighted that we are speaking about the topic of apartheid. And the reason that I'm delighted about the fact that we're speaking about apartheid is because for so many years, all of the talk that there was in Palestine was very much only focused on this idea of occupation. And the distinction is a very important one. Occupation, by its very nature, by the very rules of the game, is something that is designed to be temporary. We haven't seen this 53-year-long occupation coupled with a 53-year-long colonization process. And so for more than 50 years, as the world was focused on the issue of occupation, it was in effect trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. And the reason is that Israel went along with all of this by by in effect saying that the occupation was somehow going to be temporary, even when we saw that Israel was building and expanding settlements, even when this settler colonial process continued and went in further in depth, Israel continued to mask it and to hide it by saying that this is just an occupation. And we saw this in the way, in particular, in the way that the Israeli courts have dealt with everything from settlements to the wall to all of the quote unquote security measures. They're always viewed in this mindset or in this framework that somehow this is temporary. And the reason that I think it's so important for us to speak about apartheid is because it isn't a question of just maneuvering the small intricate elements of occupation, whether something violates international humanitarian law or doesn't violate international humanitarian law, but looks at Israel as the system as a whole. And as I know you have been speaking about in your series, with the wonderful piece that was put together by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, that their focus is not just on the minutia of apartheid. There's apartheid in the West Bank, and then there's apartheid in Gaza, and there's apartheid in Jerusalem, and there's apartheid inside 48, inside Israel itself, but looking at the grand system. And the grand system that is in place in this territory that Israel controls is one of apartheid, where there are superior rights and superior privileges given to one set of people, and inferior rights and inferior status given to another group. And I know that Yara and Munir have done a fantastic job of laying out just how that inferior status works. And that's why I think it's really important for us to really keep in mind that when we're talking about apartheid, it isn't just a new language, but it's also a question of what are the tools that are available for us. We've seen that in the past, the United Nations went down the path of setting up and creating an entire convention that's against apartheid. And we've also seen that the mechanisms that were in place that were to counter apartheid in South Africa as well. And so this is why it's so vital for us to not just stick to making these comparisons between what happened in South Africa and what's happening, what Israel is doing, but to look at the overall structure and therefore also to look at the overall remedy. And this is why, for me, the overall remedy is to be focusing on the big picture. How is it that an apartheid regime should be treated? It shouldn't be treated by looking at the various symptoms. It should be treated by looking at the disease. And the disease is Zionism, the disease is apartheid. And this is why it's so vital for somebody like me to be pressing, as I know you already do, on the issue of boycott, divestment, sanctions, because that will be the mechanism that will take us to being actually able to address apartheid Israel in the same way that apartheid South Africa was addressed. Using these other mechanisms that we've tried in the past, whether it was negotiations or bilateral systems or UN resolutions or condemnations, etc., is not the system that is going to work. We now need to start focusing on Israel as a whole, because that system of apartheid affects everybody as a whole, and start putting into place mechanisms that will address that system as a whole. I'm going to stop here. Thank
you. Can I ask one question before you go?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So why doesn't the West get it?
This is a great question. I think for a couple of reasons. One is because our knowledge of apartheid is very much focused on the way that apartheid was practiced in South Africa. And because that is the model, we can't seem to understand that there's apartheid practice elsewhere. Similarly, you know, if you look at the way that different types of abuse have been classified. In the past, it was only considered a certain way, that abuse only happens in one way. It's only when we start waking up and start recognizing that there can be apartheid in other shapes, other forms. In South Africa, it was particularly stark. When it comes to the case of Israel, it's not so stark in the sense that there aren't signs that say, for Palestinians only or for Jews only. It's much more in cities. It's much more developed. And so the reason I think that the West doesn't get it is in part because of the history of South Africa, in part because they don't want to get it. And in part because so much of our focus over the course of the past 53 years has been strictly on that of occupation. And given that it's been strictly focused on occupation, it's so easy to look at soldiers and say, I want the occupied forces out. It's much more difficult for people to also say, I want that whole system of laws that actually discriminates against every person who is living between the river and the sea, who is not Jewish. I want that system dismantled.
Thank you very much indeed. I know you have to leave, so thank you so much for giving us your time. Thank you. Thank you. And as Diana leaves us, I think, I mean, maybe that's a question I'll ask Yara and maybe Munir to reflect on from where they are. I mean, we can sort of talk about why, say, in the UK they don't get it. We might be able to say something. But do you want to add anything, Yara, or first on this question in particular? Why doesn't the West get it?
I mean, I think they do get it. If we're talking about Western regimes, I mean, it depends who you're talking about. The West isn't a sort of a hegemonic body. If we're talking about the people, perhaps because, as Deanna pointed out, that it doesn't look the same as South African apartheid, so people might struggle with that analysis. If we're talking about the regimes, they get it, they know. It's about whether they're interested in bringing its downfall, and they're not, because it serves the political powers, it serves all kinds of different interests to keep supporting the Israeli regime and to keep oppressing the Palestinian people. So they do get it. I wish it was as simple as they simply don't understand, and PSC could, you know, do a bunch of lectures for the world leaders and then we'd be liberated. But unfortunately, they do get it and they don't care. But
if I could push you a bit, you say they do get it. What evidence do you sort of glean that they do get it? In other words, you know, a lot of them don't go to Palestine, Israel. They just follow, they get that sort of Hasbara and so on from the Israeli side. And so they haven't done, that might be one of the reasons.
From my experience with speaking to a lot of diplomats and politicians, a lot of them understand fully that Israel is a state that, you know, proclaims itself as Jewish, and they understand fully that there are non-Jews living here. But for them, you know, the maintaining the Jewish majority of the state of Israel, or the Jewish character of the state of Israel, is more important than ensuring that there are equal rights for all of the people that live under Israeli sovereignty. So I think it is very clear for many of these people who, you know, have an understanding, many of these politicians and diplomats who work on this kind of on the Palestine file, as it were. But it's not in political interest to do anything about it. They can. There are multiple methods and mechanisms that they can draw upon, such as sanctioning the state of Israel, which is, you know, what they have done in other places where there have been violations, grave violations of human rights. But it's not in the political interest of anyone to sanction Israel.
Munir, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I would add that, of course, all of you have better experience in the West because that's where you're living your daily lives. But my own experience, whether during living there, maybe in the UK a bit and in the US a bit, but also following from where I live now, I noticed that there is a lot of silencing when it comes to raising the Palestine issue. If you're a professor in a university and you speak about Palestine, you will get so much noise around your job being sustained, about your articles being published, etc. If you're a journalist, if you are a TV station, if you're a radio station, if you are a website, whatever you do, whatever you say, you will either be accused of one of two accusations that are usually ready for people who explain what is going on in Palestine. Either anti-Semitism, and if you criticize Israel now, even in the European Union, they want to equate anti-Semitism with, in a way, with criticizing Israel or with most criticism of Israel. And the other accusation would be supporting terrorism. So they choose one or both for people who want to speak, and by that they manage actually to silence people. I have living in the UK, I would say, and that would be appropriate for this audience. Living in the UK, I've noticed while I was doing events for Palestine that in academic institutions, you will not get any similar resistance and the fear of the administration of the academic institution from speech for any topic, according to my experience, as much as when it comes to Palestine. There was an academic institution that I was involved with that even wanted to develop its bylaws in a way that would allow to stop events at any moment, basically, even the day of the conduct, when this event is supposed to be conducted. Just because people might say that I've been offended by this event, or this event might offend me. And the only people who actually raised this issue were people who claim that that the events that discuss Palestine might be offensive to them or scare them or whatever. So I think this is something that should be added and should be considered as one of the reasons why people don't get it. I think people don't hear it enough, and they, if you speak it, you will be attacked heavily.
Since I've got you, there was a question specifically on Jerusalem, so I'll ask it, Munir, if I may. But you mentioned the children who are born to parents who don't both have Jerusalem ID. The question was, what happens to them, to those without residency when they become adults?
Yeah,
that's really...
Yeah, no, that's a big problem, and that's a problem that we deal with every day in our legal aid work. So if you become an adult and you still live in Jerusalem and in Palestine, and you haven't managed to be registered in the right age, you will never be registered. You will continue living hiding. There are people who grew up beyond the age of 18 who do not carry an ID card at all. They cannot open a bank account. They cannot cash checks, which means effectively they cannot work legally or normally. So they keep hiding. They cannot pass checkpoints. They cannot travel abroad. So they actually live hiding. They avoid going out from home. They might work illegally or even use someone else's bank account in order to, or someone else's, who sometimes take advantage of the situation. And there are people of all ages in that situation in Jerusalem. If you are abroad, it's as simple as you will never come back. You will never be allowed to return to Jerusalem or to enter Jerusalem. And that's it. Manage your problem abroad. But for those who are here, their life is miserable. And we deal with that every day. And unfortunately, there are no remedies in the Israeli legal system for that. There is nothing our lawyers can do to register these people after after they become adults.
Thank you very much indeed. Yara, just picking up on the checkpoints issue, you might want to add something, but on the checkpoints issue, there was a question that needs clarifying. Do all checkpoints have international observers? I know the answer, but and does their presence make any difference when they are there? From Eileen. So what difference do checkpoints make to the lives of Palestinians?
I think the question is, what difference does international observers make at the checkpoints?
No, what difference do the checkpoints make, actually their presence, and do they have international observers?
Okay, well, no, they don't have international observers at the checkpoints. And even if there were international observers, it wouldn't make a difference. Israel quite frequently commits violations of human rights in front of the world's media, and they have no problem doing so. We saw that most epically and horrifically in Gaza during the Great Return March, when thousands of unarmed Palestinian protesters were shot at and gunned down in front of the world's media, and they were not stopped, or really nothing was done about that. So unfortunately, international presence does very little. I wouldn't say that it's unimportant. I do think it's important to document violations of human rights and document these crimes. I think that's essential. But unfortunately, it doesn't do much to stop them while they're happening. What it does do, though, the documentation, is build the possibility for war crimes cases, and we do need that for the future when we get to that point where we can charge Israel and specific Israelis for war crimes.
And then another question, which has come more than once, related to, is it possible to build a sort of mass
that have just happened, where Bahrain and UAE have signed recognition and normalization agreements with Israel in exchange for arms and in exchange for trade. These are essentially warmongering, human rights abusing countries who are all signing deals of recognition with each other so they can go on abusing human rights and warmongering. So I think now is time more than ever to think of a transnational struggle, a struggle that transcends borders and peoples for a fairer, more just world, and not just against apartheid, because apartheid is simply a mechanism of a much larger structure. But that's really what I would advocate for.
Okay, Munir, would you like to add to that?
Yes.
The mass anti-apartheid versus the wider issue regarding Palestine, and indeed more sort of global issues.
I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think that now the chance of this becoming more and more acceptable and use the framework of apartheid is actually is happening. There is progress happening now. I remember a discussion 15 years ago in Palestine with a human rights organization. And during that period, there was a fear from that organization, but also a wider fear in Palestine about regarding using the term apartheid and the framework of apartheid. And this is mainly because the people felt, in Palestine, I'm saying now, people felt that it's either or. Either you use the framework of apartheid, or you use the framework of occupation and colonization, etc. And so people at the time were afraid. Now, I've been noticing how this fear has been deteriorating over the past, let's say, 15 years. It has been deteriorating because people now understand that there is no contradiction between using both frameworks, and that regardless of what you believe should be the outcome of in this conflict, the outcome of the peace process, or whatever you want to call it, or the end goal of this struggle, whether you want it to be one state or two states, etc. Regardless of your opinion, you can still use the apartheid regime because it's important, because it reflects the real facts on the ground. This is what is going on. It is apartheid, whether it is in the occupied territory, whether it is in Israel. It's a regime that needs to be changed. And once we get to the full realization of this, we will be able to actually address the core issues and the basic issues fundamentally. We will learn that only by changing the regime itself, and not only by redrawing borders here and there and creating a new state or 2 states or 3 states or 5 states, it doesn't matter. There is a regime that is acting in a way that discriminates systematically and creates inhumane conditions for a certain type of people only because of their ethnic, national, and religious origin. And this is, this has to change. After that, all the other problems will become much easier to solve, regardless of what the final solution we're talking about is. So I think the Palestinians are starting to understand this. The Palestinian civil society is leading in this discussion, certainly, before the PLO. The PLO, I think, started to follow. I know at least that in the referral of the State of Palestine to the International Criminal Court, the crime of apartheid was mentioned as a crime that they asked the prosecutor to investigate. So there is, it's happening, but this will also help us to call for the rest of the world to intervene using this framework as well. It makes a big difference.
Thank you very much. I said I'd add something about this. I know that Dr. Rima Khalaf, who was mentioned earlier, so she was the ESQA chief who commissioned the report that Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley wrote. So back in November, she actually held a major event in Istanbul, which I attended, which was about setting up if you like, an anti-apartheid coalition. I think, and that brought a lot of the experts and those involved in this. Unfortunately, I think Corona came very soon after that, so there wasn't an opportunity to progress that, but I know she's very committed to now taking that further from the report that was held. If I can finish with one question. I know there are lots of webinars tonight and people may be looking to go to others, but so we asked why does the West get it? What about Israeli society? There was a mention here of the issue of domination, but do they get it? Do they think, I mean, I know here speaking to some Israelis who are academics and so on, they now accept the issue of apartheid is a real thing to state, but the people, the Israelis, do they really get the notion of apartheid, which is what we're talking about tonight, not occupation and other things, but particularly apartheid? I don't know, Yara, if you have a view on that.
I certainly do. I think it's very easy for Israelis not to see Palestinians at all and to live in a bubble, because that is how the system has been created. And actually, I would like to draw a comparison to South Africa. And this is not to excuse anyone. I think there is no excuse not to know. But, also many white South Africans at the time said, well, that was, that's just how it was. That was the system. We didn't really notice it. And of course, if you're in the dominating class of privileged people, you don't have to see it. You don't have to notice it, because your life is, really tip top, and you're living in these gated communities, and you only see Palestinians as perhaps laborers or, cleaners or whatever. And Israel has really created the infrastructure of that. And that is the point of apartheid, to limit the interactions between people, so that the dominant group doesn't have to have the horror of, coming face to face with the nasty things that they are complicit in. I would also say about Israeli society that it's a highly militarized society, and this is also by design. Israelis are conscripted into the army at the age of 18. They have to serve unless they have medical conditions that don't allow them to serve. And whilst not all of them are in what's called combat, they're all, many of them are part, cogs in the machine. They're part of this. They're complicit, and they know that there is a group of people that they are dominating, and unfortunately, because of the entrenched sort of propaganda and the brainwashing that happens, this ideal, this state of fear that Israel makes its citizens, forces its citizens to believe. A lot of Israelis think that it's a necessary evil to keep Palestinians in these small enclaves, to keep Palestinians tightly controlled, because a lot of them have dehumanized us to such an extent that they believe that we are all terrorists. And the state continues to prop that up. So when you have a state that props that up, you have your education system that props that up, you have popular media that props that up, it's very easy to believe it and to be complicit with it. And this is, of course, not to remove, I don't want to remove their agency, because there are anti-Zionist Israelis who have broken free of that system and have realized their complicity, and do try to fight against the system, but they're very few. They are very, very few indeed. So my point here is that it's possible to see what you're doing when you're part of the oppressing and dominating class. But unfortunately, an overwhelming majority, over 90%, are not interested in it.
Thank you. Munir?
I think Yara gave a wonderful answer. I would just add to that, that one of the characteristics that you can actually see that they are linked with the Israeli regime is denial. Since 1948, this regime has been consistently and systematically denying all of the injustices that it has been doing to the Palestinians, and alternatively creating new stories, sometimes fictional, in order to convince maybe first and foremost their own population, but also the rest of the world, of why whatever they are doing is justified. And this is done in different circles and different levels. You will find it on the governmental level, on the judiciary level, on different levels. It's very consistent. So, of course, most of the population, the Israeli population, fall into this, because the education system, for example, is also based on denial, and the media and everything else. So only those who, can really independently think and have this great sense of justice manage to eventually grow out of this denial and realize that there is something fundamental that needs to be changed.
Thank you both very much indeed. And of course, what the way that the American administration is behaving is emboldening Israel to carry on, to extend, whether we call it apartheid, everything that it does, because it can do no wrong. And unfortunately now, the Arab countries that have entered this through normalization with apartheid, this is what they've done. They've actually signed agreements with an apartheid state, which is completely shameful. And I hope that no others will do the same, and indeed that some of the others begin to reflect on the reality of what they're doing and to stand up to the bullying of the Americans, because that's partly why they're doing it at the moment. I'd like to thank our speakers, Diana, who left us, Munir and Yara, for a really, really fast-paced and very informative webinar. The next one is next week. So I hope that you will join us for that, and there'll be one more after that. In the meantime, we've got to keep up the fight here in the UK. So please join PSC and get active. There are over 60 branches around the country. I'm sure there's one near you if you're not a member yet. So we look forward to you joining us and to being really active in your area. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.